The gravity of the time is such that every new avenue of peace, no matter how dimly discernible, should be explored. Never before in history has so much hope for so many people been gathered together in a single organization. You will provide a great share of the wisdom, of the courage, and the faith which can bring to this world lasting peace for all nations and happiness and well-being for all men.
So we're here today with Eli Dorado, who is the Senior Research Fellow at the Center of Growth and Opportunity. Growth and Opportunity, is that right?
Yes.
Perfect. Welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Well, we've gotten to know each other a lot more over the last few months or so. And where did we meet initially?
I think we met at a Foresight Institute event.
Okay, so that was quite a while ago then.
In San Francisco.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And I'm going to make you blush a little bit, but you are what I consider one of the great thinkers of our day. And every time that I've gotten to meet with you, I almost can't believe we haven't done a podcast yet, because the conversations are some of the most insightful and riveting that I've ever had.
I'm speechless. Yes, you're making me blush.
Okay, now you have to prove it to the audience.
Yeah.
Okay. So first, before we get into today's modern topics and your perspective on the world, let's just talk about you as an individual. Where did you grow up?
So I was actually born in Brazil and lived there until I was 4, and then lived in Europe until I was about 9. I lived in Greece and Portugal, and then New Jersey after that. So, yeah.
What were the circumstances that led to your family being so international?
Well, my dad was Brazilian, so that was part of it. And he worked for a drug company, and just he started in Brazil and took him to Brazil, Greece, Portugal, New Jersey, Canada after that, actually after I was out of the house, and then late in his career he went to Boston. So it was he's been moving his whole professional life, moving around.
So I have to ask, and we'll get to the rest of your career in a minute, but do you have you reflected on your own upbringing and thought that maybe this this very unique international exposure gave you a different perspective, a different way of thinking fundamentally?
In some ways, yeah. I was always interested in things like GDP, right? Or when I was growing up, we did GNP, right? Gross National Product, right? But I was always looking at the World Almanac and okay, I've been to this country and they have this GNP per capita, and this country has this GNP per capita, and I was super interested in that from age 7 to 9 even. I was looking at that kind of stuff.
And when did your interests become not so broadly economic but more industry focused, or was there any point where you're I'm really interested in this industry and in this subset of GNP?
I would say it was kind of a few years into my career when I was initially my first job out of grad school.
Where did you go to grad school?
I got a PhD in economics at George Mason University.
Great, one of the best places.
Yes,
to go
one of the super fun and just great people.
And do you want to just give a shout out to some of your professors and colleagues and coworkers?
Yeah, I mean, I did my PhD under Tyler Cowen, who is wonderful, and took every class I could with Alex Tabarrok and Brian Kaplan and Robin Hansen and so on. So it was just it was a great experience. Yeah,
incredible mentors. And what was the focus? Did you have a specific thesis or?
Well, yeah, you have to write a dissertation, obviously, to do a PhD. And so I wrote on the political stability of anarchy, actually, and under what conditions it could be stable.
Okay, before we get on to everything else, we have to dissect this a little bit. So what is the definition of anarchy here?
Anarchy is sort of a system where there is no monopolist on violence or on governance. Yes. Right, so
because that's what a stable government almost is. It's a monopoly.
It's a monopoly on a certain class of services and enforcement and so on. And there are arguably a few instances in history, probably the clearest cut one is medieval Iceland, where there was no like executive branch of government, and that those functions were all sort of provided on the market in a sort of like quasi-feudal way, but like in the sense of like you could change your allegiance between lords like on the fly, like just like you change like insurance providers or something like that. You could be like, yeah, I'm taking down this guy's banner and I'm putting up this guy's banner, and so they would sort of compete for these sort of protection services. And if you look at like the Icelandic sagas, like a lot of literatures are about like battles and stuff, and the sagas are all about courtroom drama, right? So they had courts, and but it was all like kind of decentralized and not not a monopoly system. And so there's this argument, and so my thesis was about this like sort of academic argument. Tyler had written a previous paper on why anarchy can never be stable, which is a little belied by the historical evidence. And so I kind of tried to refine it a little bit and say like, well, here's why it could be stable under those conditions and not maybe today under the conditions that exist today.
And this wasn't just a difference in semantics, this was a difference in perspective altogether.
It was a difference, it was just a difference in sort of the model. So he was really focusing on the costs of cooperation, of different kinds of cooperation. So you can cooperate to collude, and you can cooperate to coordinate. And those are both forms of cooperation. And his argument was, if you're cooperating to coordinate on what the law is, for example, in a decentralized way, then what's stopping you from being cooperating to collude between the sort of providers of those security services, let's say? They could just collude and become a monopolist, right? So he's saying if it's cheap to cooperate in one way, it's also cheap to cooperate in the other way, and therefore anarchy is impossible. And so my argument was there's a cost and benefit you have to look at. So we don't just look at costs of things, we look at benefits of things as well. And so anarchy works when the cost benefit of cooperating to coordinate works. It is favorable, but the cost benefit of cooperating to collude is not favorable.
Let me ask a question that I've pondered more broadly on this topic in your framing. Are there multiple fundamentally different stable systems, or is any stable system based on human nature and the fundamental laws of economics the same but with a different patina?
What do you mean by that?
I guess I'm wondering, when you mentioned collude, I think, okay, well, certainly our system, has rules and laws against collusion, but really we all know people still collude, both in explicit and implicit ways. And so then that got me thinking, well, is every system throughout time that approaches some sort of stability fundamentally the same, but we just haven't defined or labeled various characteristics of it, and thus we've created almost like artificial, like surface level differences where really humans are humans, economics are economics, incentives are incentives.
I'm really enamored with this idea. There's a paper called "Do We Ever Really Get Out of Anarchy?" Right, which made the case that even if you look at, say, the United States, we have three branches of government, right? We have the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. Okay, so let's say those branches have a dispute between them. Who wins, right? Like, we don't know. It's like it's not determined. There's no outside enforcer, right? And that's just like one example of how, in a sense, those branches of government are in an anarchy relation relative to each other, and they kind of have to work it out among themselves.
I see. So at the macro picture, it looks like stability, but in reality, we have a bunch of molecules bouncing around.
Yeah, so I think when I'm talking about like political anarchy here, I'm talking about like the stable forms of it, right? Where like just like in a
okay, so you're not taking the position that nothing is ever really stable in the long run. I'm thinking about like the non-chaotic forms of anarchy, right? Like the forms of anarchy, and I'm not
personally, like I don't want to like live under anarchy, but like the idea here is that there could be forms of anarchy that are stable and that would be, you know, potentially even nice to live under, right? Like that in terms of you're getting all the services that you get from government today, except you're getting them on the competitive market instead of from a monopoly supplier,
yes.
right? And so that's like the principle. Could it be that you get, you know, security, all these public goods, et cetera, like provided by the competitive market instead of like a single supplier?
And is it that maybe technology can be the great enabler of this, and that we can disconnect things, you know, government services that have historically been tied to your geographic location to those that can now be virtualized or digitalized? So
yes, like the sort of the technological dispensation that you live under like matters for this. That's part of my argument. Like it doesn't always cut the way you think, right? So like going back to an earlier paper from Tyler, like he made a point that you couldn't have had the size of government that we have without at least 20th century technology, right? Like in the 1800s, like there was no government that controlled 30 to 40% of GDP.
Yeah.
You couldn't have it, right? They didn't have like the record keeping ability. They didn't have computers to just like even know who pays how much income tax or whatever, right? So you literally couldn't have the administrative state and or the communication system to like rule over like a vast territory and like extract 30 to 40% in sort of taxes, right? So absolutely, taxes and technology matters for, you know, how stable or, you know, what kind of government you're going to live under.
Interesting. You went to the tax collection point. I was still thinking along the monopoly over violence. When
Yeah.
you came to that.
Yeah, sure.
Interesting. Okay, so so you had a lot of fun in grad school
Yes.
putting together this work. What did that lead to?
Well, it led me to realizing I did not want to be like a real economist, right? Like an economist that like works at like in an academic econ department trying to publish in econ journals. I have a lot more fun just like thinking about whatever interests me, and so that drove me into sort of the tech policy world because it I just have a natural interest in it, and sort of a lot of the things I learned in grad school in terms of like industrial organization about like, you know, sort of basically advanced microeconomics, right? Like the different ways that these parties relate to each other and stuff. That made me like really interested in sort of a lot of tech things. So I ended up, you know, sort of blogging to procrastinate on my dissertation and so on, and ended up getting hired to do tech policy at the Mercatus Center.
Who reached out to you first? Because to me, these are always like two distinct worlds. Now, I happen to be exposed to the economics world through Tyler Cowen's podcast. But I come from the tech world, and before I moved to DC, it was so difficult for me to connect with anyone outside of the tech world. So how did you?
A guy named Jerry Brito, you know, who was at the Mercatus Center running the tech program there, and he reached out to me. He's now he's executive director of Coin Center, which does like cryptocurrency policy here in DC. But so he reached out. It was like, hey, let's have lunch. You know, I wrote a paper for him, and I was kind of talking to him about like, hey, maybe I'd want to do this full time. And he was like, yeah, great, we'll create a position for you, and they did, and sort of. You know, the rest is history. When he left to go found Coin Center, I actually took over his job and directed the program. Sort of around that same time, I got a real interest in moving beyond just like software, and which is kind of the main thing that we focused on. You know, copyright and you know, kind of and internet governance and kind of those are kind of the issues we were talking about before. And I was like, well, we got to do some stuff in the world of atoms because that's, you know. That's what really matters. So started working on things like drone policy before there was like a really big drone industry. Kind of once I did everything I wanted to do there, I kind of took my FAA knowledge and decided I wanted to do some supersonics policy. So I did wrote a paper on supersonics. Ended up then getting in contact with a company called Boom, which was building a supersonic airliner, and sort of one thing led to another. I ended up joining them as their first policy hire, first DC employee, and sort of ran their policy program for 2.5 years or so.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing. And okay, so they hired someone that came from an academic background for this, not from a lobbying background. Were you like complemented or resourced to tackle the lobbying side, or was their thinking just fundamentally different on how to influence policy?
Yeah, we had a lobbyist like on contract and stuff, and so I was providing mostly strategic direction, like I interface with engineers a lot, right? So one of the things that I think made me pretty successful in that job is I talked to engineers and like really tried to learn what the challenges were.
But that's what I want to hear about, because that is a huge culture shock, going from the ivory tower to the belly of a startup.
Sure.
What can you just reflect maybe on those first 6 months of you getting your feet wet, or I don't know if that's the right time period, but tell me how you felt, and maybe articulate to our audience like the challenges and the frustrations of joining.
Yeah,
it's a very challenging.
So it was not only like completely new world for me. It was they were in Denver and I was in DC, right? Like because I was.
Was this?
This was 2017.
Okay.
So yeah, so I joined on. I felt like I had so much to learn. Like looking back on it, it's like amazing that they let me take this job at all, because I knew almost nothing about airplanes, other than I knew some of the policy stuff that I had written about, but like, how airplanes work, et cetera. Like what are the challenges that engineers face while doing this? What are the different constraints that they're trying to face? I knew very little of it, and I just had to learn a lot of it really fast. I sort of, they kind of told me I had basically unlimited budget to fly back and forth between Denver and DC, and so I went every month at least, and I just kind of, when I was there, I would just like soak it up and talk to people and ask questions, and really try to learn it. I at one point bought an airplane design textbook and just started reading it, and it was like super useful to do that.
Now let me ask you a question about that too, because this is something also that in my exploration of a new sector, I found textbooks to just be the way to get up to speed. But I hated textbooks when I was in undergrad. Like, keep them away from me.
Yeah.
Did you always? But you're a PhD. Did you always have a love for sifting through textbooks, or was this like a new strategy for you, given your role?
Yeah, this was new. I would not say, like in school, I pored over textbooks, right? Like sort of in grad school, it's more journal articles anyway. Like even if you have a textbook, it's like you get journal articles assigned, and those are more important to read. But yeah, I agree. Like I think textbooks are written so that like anybody can pick them up and like learn the material in them, and they're extremely valuable. I think underutilized resource by a lot of people.
Totally underutilized, and I also think people read textbooks the wrong way. So what I found actually be super useful is reading textbooks backwards. So let's say in power plant engineering, they start, especially nuclear, they start with the atomic physics and split. This is so abstract. It's like, oh my God, I'm like, my brain is hurting before I even start. But if you go to the back of the textbook, they talk about real power plants that were built, show you the real schematics. Like, okay, this is something tangible. So I just read them backwards.
Yeah.
And I felt that every time that I wanted to get a more fundamental understanding of a specific part or component or system, going backwards.
Yeah. I didn't try that way. I went from the front on the airplane one, but yeah, it worked. At least I would not trust myself to design an airplane today, but I would. But I can talk to aircraft engineers.
And you know the right questions to ask.
Exactly.
Okay, I want to hear about some of the challenge though, because startups are hard.
Yeah.
Especially, you know what's harder than a startup? A hardware startup.
Yes.
No, you know what's harder than a hardware startup? A hardware startup in a heavily regulated environment.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. So like the biggest thing that I spent my time on was landing and takeoff noise. So if you're building a supersonic airplane, like a subsonic airplane has wings that are like this, but a supersonic airplane has wings that are like this, and that means you need more thrust to weight on takeoff, right? And the fact that...
Can you actually just re-describe that for the audio-only audience?
Sure, yeah. So the wings on a subsonic airplane are out wide whereas the wings on a supersonic aircraft are pointed more back. So it's a narrower wingspan on the supersonic airplane, and that means you need a higher thrust to weight ratio on takeoff, which means you're going to be louder. And then the other thing is, when you are cruising at full speed, any sort of like cross-sectional surface area is adds huge amounts of drag, right? And so you can't do the normal trick that subsonic airplanes do to get quieter, which is to increase the bypass ratio of the engine. So they make the engine wider, more fan. All that fan on the airplane is still generating thrust, but you can't have as much of that on a supersonic airplane.
Why they did that? That's just for noise. It's not for like.
Well, for an given amount of thrust. How fuel efficient and how loud is it, right? Like it's both, yeah. But yeah, noise is a huge deal. It turns out in aviation, right? And if you think about like people who live under the flight path or whatever, like they complain all the time and so on. And so if you tell them like, oh, we're building a new supersonic airplane, don't worry, it'll be quieter, a lot quieter than sort of Concorde was, which was very loud. They're just like, well, yeah, but how much quieter? I want it quieter than the subsonic planes. Yeah. And you're like, well, that is barred by the laws of physics, right? Like you can't, you really can't get quieter probably than a subsonic plane with today's technology anyway, right? And so, the question was like, how quiet could we get? Even legally, like what were the requirements? They weren't clear at all, and we got to a good place, with FAA. But then you still have the sort of international standards, right? And aviation is a global market, so you've got to comply with everybody's standards. So you've got, if FAA gives you one standard and Europe gives you another, they always end up coordinating. But if Europe gives you a more stringent standard, you got to go with the more stringent standard. And so, so I think fundamentally the reason, what's amazing, right? So Concorde, if we could build just Concorde today, like with modern technology, it would be an amazing plane. It would be more efficient. It would be quieter. It would be cheaper to operate, et cetera. But we've thrown like all of the gains that we've had from computational fluid dynamics, from better materials like carbon fiber instead of aluminum, from more efficient engine cores, which the engine cores get about 1% more efficient a year, 0.5% to 1% per year. So we've taken all of that in, and what we've done, what the industry has done is they're like, every time that we get a new gain, they throw it into making the plane quieter, right? And so all of the gains are almost all entirely going to make it quieter on takeoff and landing.
And what is the driver behind that? Because I can't imagine that there's regulatory ratcheting every single iteration, is there? Or like, is this a self-imposed?
Well, there is ratcheting on the subsonic side. So I mean, and I think in a way that makes complete sense, right? What they kind of do. So I ended up participating a lot at ICAO, which is the UN agency that does aviation rule coordination between all the different countries. And what they do there, it makes kind of sense, is that they just basically say every few years they'll look at like, well, how quiet are the late model airplanes given for their weight, and then they just like, okay, we're just going to set a standard to be like no louder than the late model planes. So what's demonstrated on the market as like a profitable aircraft, they're like, okay, you can't be louder than that anymore.
Okay, let's talk like bigger picture. Who is driving that direction of optimization versus cost or speed or comfort or any of these other things? What is the force? What is the big force?
I think it's NIMBYs, right? So it's like the people who live near the airport. Maybe they moved in after the airport already existed, right? They moved to the nuisance, and they complain and so on. So when I was at Mercatus, my friend Raymond Russell and I wrote a short paper just like documenting how concentrated the complaints are. So if you look at DC, So some people in the flight path of DCA, like up in like sort of northwest DC by the river, there was one household that was responsible for 78% of the complaints that DCA got in like 2015 or something like that.
But to me, this is upsetting, and maybe this is just a broader conversation, how that translates to real political or regulatory power. So for instance, I'm still having trouble bridging the connection between an individual's or even thousands of individual home complaints to somebody, to that translating to an international standards body's standards changing. Like, and why isn't there a countervailing force where clearly you could demonstrate mathematically if those gains were, instead of translating to noise reductions, changing to fuel cost reductions? How is that not a pot of money that could go to influence that standards body for that being the thing?
Yeah. So I think that for subsonic planes, if you take subsonic planes on their own, like the fuel and improvement and the noise reduction kind of went together, right? So nobody was really against it being quieter over time. They were just like, well, we'll figure out how to increase the bypass ratio a little bit more, and it works out great for everybody.
So I bet there is somewhere in the system there's an engineering trade-off where you could...
Sure. There's got to be. But for the most part, they came together, and so there was not really much resistance. And the thing about when it got to supersonics, it got really interesting because obviously everybody wants it to be quieter, but then I think a lot of the regulators, particularly the European ones, like they would use noise as a sort of a cudgel, because they were sort of, what they were, I mean, very clearly doing is they were looking out for European industry, right? So companies like Dassault and Airbus had zero plans to do anything on supersonics at all, and they saw these 3-4 startups in the U.S. all like pursuing supersonic technology, and they're like, well, we can put a stop to that.
And is there an economics term for this, where the incumbents create these artificial moats, but specifically, or not artificial moats, they create real moats, but almost through like a misdirection? So claiming it's for one purpose, but really it's to protect their entrenched position.
Yeah, I mean, the general phenomenon is called not of the sort of misdirection part, but in general it's regulatory capture, right? So the regulator is acting on behalf of the industry, basically.
And what about the misdirection part? Is there a term?
I've never come across anything like that.
Because
right?
I think this is a lesson that can be, we're talking about aviation right now, but I'm sure our listeners can think of how this might apply to other topics.
Yes.
As well.
Yes. I don't know of a good term for it.
Yeah. Well, maybe.
We should come up with one.
In a book. Maybe write it someday.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so we talked a bit about your experience in aviation. I mean, we could spend hours more talking about it there. But now you're to tell us about your transition to your current role, but really kind of highlight what how your breadth has, or how your focus has changed, the wide breadth of topics.
Yeah. So I left Boom in 2019 and took a few months to like decompress and figure out what I wanted to do, and ended up joining the Center for Growth and Opportunity, which is led by my colleague Chris Koopman, who was in the office next to me at Mercatus, and so we kind of knew each other. We kind of had many talks about like what's the right way to run a university research center and so on. So
what university is this?
So we're at Utah State University. So I'm here in DC area, but the org is there, and I'm going out to Utah like twice in the next couple months. So it's great.
Utah is it?
They're in Logan, Utah, northern Utah, and so I just talking with Chris. I was like, what I want to do is like a lot more figuring out how to end what I call the great stagnation, right? A lot of industrial, a lot of industries are stagnating and in some cases, declining. Like supersonic aviation, one of those, but nuclear, as you know, is also extremely stagnant. And I want to tackle a lot of these issues. I kind of the first thing I wanted to take on was permitting. So if you've ever heard of the law NEPA, so I've just done a ton of digging on like what is actually going on with NEPA, and what's taking why do we have to do these like multi-thousand page environmental impact statements that nobody reads, supposedly to inform the public and so on, and all these projects. But in general, yeah, I'm looking at like what are the big chunks of GDP that are big because of relatively low productivity growth, right? Like so naturally, like if you had a sector of the economy where like the productivity growth was outpacing the rest of the economy, it would tend to shrink, right? It would get smaller, right? If we're getting 100x more productive a year or something like that, it would shrink to almost zero, right? Like it would get to almost zero. So if you see like a really big sector of the economy, it's like a pretty good bet that it might be big because it's like it's getting less productive than the rest, relatively less productive relative to the rest of the economy.
Education, healthcare, that type of stuff.
I think the ones I'm really focused on is health, housing, energy, transportation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Before I do want you, there's a couple questions I want to ask about. You call it the Great Stagnation.
Yeah.
But before we do, how is it that a school in Utah came to house this, like what I consider an extremely important mission? Like, how'd that become the focal point?
So we're based at the Huntsman School, and I wasn't there at the founding, but I think there's just some donors who were affiliated with the school, and we're like, we want
this idea of a
that
mission.
we want this org to be founded here, and yeah.
And you and I found like our connection through almost like another like spin-off movement, Progress Week. What do we call that movement?
I don't know if there's a good name. There's a progress studies idea going around for a while.
With Jason Crawford, Jason
Crawford, yeah. So he's a friend, and yeah. So I think we both travel in those circles and affiliate with that. I don't know if there's a good name for it. I don't know if it needs a name though. I think it's like almost better if it's a little bit organic.
Right, because then we can't be the subject of attack by.
Yeah. Well. Yeah, I mean, there's lots of things that can go wrong once you institutionalize.
Yeah,
too early.
Well, that's a whole nother.
Yeah.
Exactly, that's a whole nother area to talk about. Is there consensus? Maybe there's a lack of interest, but is there consensus that there is a Great Stagnation happening, or is that a hotly debated topic?
I think there's multiple positions. So one is, no, we're not stagnating. We are. Look at all the information technology stuff we have. Like that's actually where the value is. Like when you think about where we spend our attention, our time, it's on Netflix and stuff, and it's never been better. And all the gains in computing, they're not properly measured in the economy, and so on. Right. So that's like one view. I think another view is. Yeah, growth has slowed down, but you know what? We're like a fully grown country at this point. Like the economy is like, we've picked the low-hanging fruit. Ideas are just getting harder to find. There's obviously we can't repeat the gains that we had sort of in the mid 20th century, where we had urban sanitation and telecommunications and electricity deployment, right? Like very fundamental things, right? And then you can't ever repeat those gains again. So that's like a second view, and then sort of a third view, which is my view, is like all that being true, like we're still stagnating, and it's not entirely. It's in large part because of choices that we're sort of making as a society, right? To sort of sort of privilege other things besides economic growth, like sort of like people not wanting, like moving near an airport and deciding that they don't want it to be loud anymore, right?
Yeah.
Like so sort of privileging the status quo or sort of the anti-growth ideas instead of just like pursuing growth as fast as we can.
And is there a darker side to your view as well, where almost like a bicycle, if you're not going forward, you're falling over on your side? Like, are you afraid that this stagnation will lead to a collapse of some sort, or do you think it'll just remain status quo?
The thing that worries me is political stability, right? So this was getting back to the dissertation, right? Like in chapter 1 of my dissertation, I wrote about how like the stability in society is driven in part by there just being a social surplus that we sort of all get, right? And if you don't get anything, then you revolt, right? Or you whatever. And so you could think about this in terms of growth, right? Like as if the economy is growing, and everybody's life is getting a little bit better every year, or at least an expectation, right? It's like, I'm going to go along with that. My life's going to be better next year, and I want to participate in
it discourages
that.
Violence.
It discourages like defecting from the system, right? And so if we get a zero-sum economy, because we're not growing anymore, right? And then the economy is zero-sum, right? And or if it's negative sum, right? If we're shrinking, then you get different behaviors. You get grasping behaviors. You get, and so that's what like the populism that we've seen stirring up.
Yes.
Right. Like I think it's driven by the fact that if you look at like sort of the bottom half of the income distribution, they really are stagnating. Like it's more than sort of the GDP per capita statistics would show. Like it's growing more slowly. And why? So it's like from that perspective, it's kind of unsurprising we're seeing this populism blowing up a little bit, but I think it's like pretty dangerous. I think we should try to get things moving again pretty fast.
I agree, and I actually think it's more dangerous than we realize, because I think there is a layer of, I don't know if pacifism is the right word, but I almost think of like a pacifier, which is this iPhone that we have, which is so distracting. I think that is actually covering up a lot of the societal discontent that is poised to create real issues.
Yeah, I mean, it worries me. Like that's the thing I worry about.
And drugs.
Well,
like people are like, I mean, there is a reason we see so many like opioid overdoses, right? It's because people are trying to distract themselves, maybe from this general societal stagnation.
Yeah, or just I think in general, just like people feeling disaffected or not wanting to do anything with their life. Yeah. Right? It's like a really bad sign.
No, and are there other how do you measure this? Are there other indicators? I mean, something that like I just have like sitting at like as a pit in my stomach is that there aren't too many like inspirational characters out there. Like we have our Musks, right? Like, but there. Do you know like back at the turn of the century, there were engineer heroes for all sorts of like just giant like civil works projects, or like there's so much to be inspired by, and so many different individuals across the world simultaneously demonstrating leadership through innovation. We don't have that much right now, do we?
Yeah, I think it's like Hollywood celebrities, right? Like to some extent, the online influencers now. I mean, like I don't know, like there's pockets of it, right? That are great. Like there's some great YouTube channels, right? Like where it's like you can learn engineering, or like you can watch people doing cool things, but yeah, for the most part,
it's heroes. I'm talking about like heroes.
Yeah, you're right.
Right, like people who have done something that is just so awe-inspiring.
Oh, and with the media being so competitive these days with the internet, like it's giving the people what they want, which is to shit on their heroes, right? Or shit on the people that are supposedly the heroes, right? And so anytime somebody achieves something great, there'll automatically be like a news story on like why this person is not that great.
Yeah. No, I know, it's crazy. So okay, but I guess to you, so you've studied this topic. You sit in some communities that get together and talk about this topic. What's the next step? What's the next phase for change or reformation? How do we think about moving forward from our foundational understanding to affecting the world?
I mean, I think fundamentally it comes down to the behavior of like elites in society, right? And like what do elites want? I think like we live in a.
Can you draw out that connection though? Is it because they have so much extra influence behind the scenes?
Yeah, well, I think like we live in a democracy, obviously, and democracies are really good at giving the median voter the thing that the median voter wants on the stuff that the median voter cares about, right? And so on like culture war topics or whatever, like anything that's like the hot issue that like the average person cares about, they're going to get what they want. It's like almost no point in trying to influence that, except, I guess you can try to influence the views of the median voter, but like within the political system, it's like kind of a constraint. Yep. We're going to give the median voter what they want on the things that they care about, but the median voter doesn't care about most things. Right? Like there's as soon as you get into a technical topic or something kind of obscure, like they don't care, right? And so who has influence on it? It's like the elites. It's like the opinion shapers. It's the people in industry. It's people in that sphere, right? And if you can create a consensus among that class of people, right, that really we need to be prioritizing growth above a lot of these other petty things. That's how you drive change, I think.
I think I tend to agree with that, but now the almost the harder question is, how do you influence this group? Are there tools? Are ideas strong enough to stand? Like, is a good idea powerful enough on its own when properly articulated to act like a virus and actually change the world? Or do we have to then layer other tools on top of our ideas? A tool could be a conference where you bring people together. A tool could be a think tank. A tool could be you buy a newspaper. I mean, so are there other?
I think there's obviously a lot of things you can do, right? I don't think it's like one idea that you can just sell like on its own to everybody, right? So I think one thing that's like has been really important, I think, in the last couple of years is, so if you take people on the left who care about climate, right, they passed the infrastructure bill, they passed the Inflation Reduction Act, there's like tons of money flowing in the industry. And like, we're realizing, we can't build. Like, we have the money. Like, they've been fighting for the money for decades or whatever, and they've got it now. Yeah. And like, they're realizing they can't build. And so the message to them is like, look, we got to be a country that builds again.
Yeah.
Right? And so you sort of you send that message around. I think with the right, maybe it's more like, China and sort of in global competition and like being able to sort of compete with, China has built 40,000 kilometers of high-speed rail since 2008. We have built zero, despite funding it. Right?
Yeah, like we live in California.
I always, and so there's the California experience, but there's also the in the 2009 stimulus there was $8 billion earmarked for high-speed rail. And we got like 0 new miles of high-speed rail service out of that. We got like 20 miles of track in New Jersey, somewhere that's like high-speed ready.
So actually, I have a question. So this message of, okay, we have to build. Now, I remember when Andreessen came out with his paper, let's say a couple of years ago. Was he a product of this idea and this community trying to influence the elites? Was that the result of it, or is he part of the community that is trying to get the message out there?
I think he's trying to get the message out. He was not the first person to sort of take that perspective, but yeah. So I think it wasn't like an entirely original thing for him, but he's like. Certainly, like he's trying to
it in British history.
Exactly.
But that's what I'm trying to figure out. I'm trying to understand the mechanics of influence. Yeah. So if it is that you come up with this idea and you meet with 20 people at like a private meeting in San Francisco, and then one of those people happens to be an associate at Andreessen Horowitz, and he reiterates that idea, and then Andreessen, responding to his own set of incentives, thinks, I want to brand myself as someone coming up with innovative ideas, and I've already got this huge platform that he then broadcasts that further, and that is naturally how an idea spreads? Or does it have to be that you have to sit down with Andreessen and a few other people and say, no, guys, we need a sustained effort, like this message is good this way but not good that way, it works with that audience, so you tackle that audience with this message, I tackle, like, how coordinated does it have to be? Or do people responding to their own incentives aid in your scalability of influence amongst elites?
I think that it's pretty organic right now, right? Like so the question of like what it should be, whether it should be more coordinated, is I think another one. But I think like so far, I mean, you have people like Mark like saying we need to build, people like Ezra Klein, right, at the New York Times, like the top left of center pundit maybe in the country. And like there's like agreement that we need to build. There's disagreements about the details and so on, but like I think that's all been pretty organic and just people who I think a lot of them identify with this progressy sort of thing have been pushing this idea, and it's getting traction.
And you're not going to say it, but I'll say it. A lot of this actually traces back to your ideas.
Some of the stuff on NEPA, particularly, like that. I think I was the first to really try to write about that.
The Ezra Klein megaphone, a lot of that comes from your brain, your thinking. And so what I want to better understand is, can your brain continue to propagate and scale to affect change in a time period that like actually matters, or do we have to do things to now supercharge these ideas at certain levels of propagation out through the system?
Like I am like constantly trying to figure out like what's the best strategy for like getting growth, right? And so like I'm just like I do think it like helps to have like a lot of fellow travelers and a lot of people like sort of like echo chambering. And I don't think like I don't do it for the credit personally, right? Like I want the ideas to sort of take off and like have a life of their own and make a big difference in the world. But I think just like sort of getting more people excited about like the fact that it's kind of like a bad news, good news situation. It's like the bad news is we're stagnating and it's because we're doing stupid things. Like the good news is like if it's because we're doing stupid things rather than just like a law of economics that we've like picked the low-hanging fruit, then the good news is we can fix it. Like we can choose not to do those stupid things.
Assuming free will.
Yes. We've had that one.
No, I get it. Yeah, it is a bad good news situation. And then I think understanding the fundamental forces. Well, I mean, I think something that we are and people in our community are beginning to dissect, and even the tech world in general over the last decade has shown an increased interest in policy, whereas Silicon Valley used to like to stay out in California. Now Silicon Valley is dipping their fingers into DC. And I think this is good in some ways, not good in others, because these are very powerful institutions and they have a tremendous amount of resources. But it is almost building out a science of influence and change, which I always do think that these big people get lazy, and then more entrepreneurial people can now take that science that they've developed and apply it as a tool to affect their own interest of change. And then you just, I guess, have to hope that the people who are most motivated are also the best intentioned.
Yeah, so I think like the AI stuff that's been going on lately, right? That there was an AI hearing a couple of months ago now, where Sam Altman testified and Gary Marcus testified and someone from IBM testified, and they were all just like, "Please regulate us."
Yeah, but that's the classic trick. They say that in pub, right? Like,
but I think the engagement there, I mean, I think is like, on Sam's part, I think it's very naive, right? Like, I think he thinks we're going to be I'm going to ask for regulation. We're going to regulate to prevent, an AI doom scenario, and that's not at all what Congress is interested in, or politicians are interested. They're interested in like regulating to like deal with all these culture war issues, right? Like all this, like, oh, is the LLM too woke or not, right? Or and so on.
The large language model.
Yes.
Language.
Yeah. So that I think is like a super naive thing, right? And like Gary Marcus just like hates tech, I think, and wants to slow it down and so on. And so no one was in that hearing like saying like, this is a thing that has enormous potential, and we need to let people experiment and see what happens before we do anything that could squash it or slow it down or burden it in any way.
And when these hearings come up, do people cite historical examples? I mean, this is something that we focus on in our conversations: aviation, nuclear. These are things that had such incredible promise and are kind of warning stories. Hey, don't do this with other new burgeoning technologies. Don't stymie them before they have a chance to blossom.
I think with the AI conversation, literally people have said we need an NRC for AI.
Oh my God.
Right? Literally people have said we need a NEPA for AI.
Oh my God.
Right? Like it's so it's just like they see these models. They don't see it. A lot of people don't see it the way you and I do. That we need this innovation. They're like we need to have a society-wide conversation about any kind of innovation that anybody might want to do before we allow it to go forward.
Let's touch upon energy.
Yeah.
I realized we haven't even talked really much about energy, but for our audiences, let's get your take on it. What are your, I don't want to say unique points, but what are the points that you want to drive home from your perspective about the world of energy, where it's been, where it could go, what we're doing right, what we're doing wrong, what we should do? Yeah,
so if you look at the energy stats in the US, right, we kind of peaked in per capita energy consumption in 1977, 1978. And since then, we've had consumed less energy per capita, right? So GDP is still going up, so it's like we're doing more with less, right? And my overall message is let's try doing more with more, right?
Yeah.
Let's have more energy and be more efficient about it, but also have more of it. And you look at a country like Iceland, which consumes about twice as much energy per capita as the U.S., and they have they're an aluminum smelting superpower, right? Because they have super cheap electricity. So overall, I want people to think about energy. Energy has been wrapped up so heavily with fossil fuels, with carbon emissions, and so on. It doesn't have to be that way, as you know. We have nuclear, we have geothermal, solar has had very impressive panel price declines. It turns out electric motors are super efficient and getting better at an amazing rate, and so we can. There's a lot we could do if we just sort of embrace this idea of we need to have more. I don't think. The thing that I've been as I've been thinking about nuclear, I don't think there have been great policy proposals for how do we get nuclear going again, right? And
why?
I don't know. I think you kind of do have to dive into the weeds pretty far before you find something, right? So the things that I'm looking at are the fact that so we have a national nuclear laboratory called INL, Idaho National Laboratory, and their sort of their job is to build test reactors, and the last test reactor that they ran was in 1967. So over 50 years of not building test reactors, and maybe next year they'll have the Marvel reactor, but that's still a huge gap. And if you look at a problem that companies have when they go to the NRC is they'll have some modeling or something that shows that the reactor is going to perform in a certain way, and the NRC is well, how did you validate the model, or where's the empirical data on this? And it's well, we need to build a reactor to test it, to validate, to get the empirical data, but we can't do it without your license, right? So there's a chicken and egg problem that INL is perfectly positioned to solve by just building a lot of test reactors, or even contracting with companies to build their sort of prototype reactors at their facilities, and that hasn't happened, right? So that's one example.
So I want to hear your answer of why, but the first thing we should mention is INL, Idaho National Labs, used to be called Argonne West. So Argonne was one of the national labs that was one of the premier, Fermi and all, Chicago, invented nuclear technology. And then they said, hey, we want to solve this issue about being able to build a bunch of reactors without having this chicken and the egg of regulation. So the easiest way to do that is buy an area of the desert that is so remote, is the size of another state. I forgot which state, Rhode Island, Vermont, or something, New Hampshire, I don't know. Buy an area that's so remote that you can just do whatever you want out there, blow it up, and I think they did blow up half their 50 reactors, which, by the way, is how you make rapid progress in the hardware space is through destructive testing.
Iterating.
Yep.
You got to iterate.
And so that's how they solved this problem. They still have all that land. The remoteness has not changed, but there is such an apprehension amongst everyone that I have met in the nuclear industry, including its most staunch advocates, including the startups themselves who benefit from this. They don't want to just go in the middle of the desert and blow something up. Why?
I don't know. I think like a lot changed around 1970, right? Like you saw, for example, NEPA passed and was signed by Richard Nixon January 1st, 1970. Right? I think of that as like the start of the era. But the anti-nuclear movement started picking up around then, right? You have just something in the culture, I think, changed around then, and I think it has seeped into this ultra caution that we see in the nuclear industry, just because they've sort of being steeped in that culture. I think a lot of times people see like, oh, if there's an accident or something, or even if it's like you say, it's like controlled, it's like purposefully in a remote place or whatever, they just would see that as negative for the industry or negative for themselves. I don't know. But
then do you think it is without having the people who are most economically motivated to try to create policy change, without having them interested in it, how do things ever change?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know. I'm not sure yet. And I think the other thing that I think about a lot in the nuclear industry is analogizing it to airplanes, right? So airplanes, airliners also have a Part 25 regulation for type certification for airliners. It is super stringent, right? Like billions of dollars to get an airliner through that regulation. And the thing that I've been coming back to lately is that if that was all we had in the aviation industry, we'd get no progress in aviation, right? But in aviation, we also have smaller planes, right? And those are Part 23 rules. They're more, still onerous, but much more manageable. We have experimental planes, right? And you can basically build an experimental plane, like send off a sheet of paper to the FAA and they give you an experimental certificate, right? We have light sport aircraft. Right, which that is even less onerous, believe it or not, than the Part 23, and then you have ultralight aircraft, which is like FAA will have no problem letting you kill yourself on an ultralight as long as you do it during the daytime and not over people, right? And so you have this sort of like release valve for the regulation. And what it means is that when you go to start a company that's building an airliner, for example, you have engineers on staff who have built an airplane before. Yes. Right? And they have all that experience from building, experimental planes or Part 23 planes. Yes. And they can, the Part 25 stuff is more stringent, but they can do it because it's just an extension of what they've been doing, and that is one of the things I think we don't have in nuclear, right? No one's ever built anything. No one has ever built anything, and there's no supply chain for a lot of things.
No, you're so right. Okay, so now I think, how do we change that? Is there? Okay, my mind is going two different directions, and you maybe kind of pick one to expound on. Is there this idea of, can we create a sandbox where anything goes because we set up the sandbox boundaries appropriately? So that's one direction maybe you want to go. Or the other one is, can we create a set of generic rules that apply across industry, across the board? So let's say with the noise, I deal with, for 5% of my waking hours, construction noise at a certain decibel level, and that is accepted by society. So can we just set a decibel level and a percentage of your year, and that applies to construction, aviation, that type of thing? So are there rules that we can do to make things, and then we appeal to the interests of certain industries that that benefits from to use their lobbying power, to use their policy power, to use their messaging power to maybe there are incentives that they wouldn't want to do this across other industries, but okay. But you get my idea.
Yeah.
Work with me on either one of those.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we can go in either one. So when I was working on supersonics, right, like I haven't talked about it yet, but there's also the sonic boom issue, right? And like, so we have over the United States a speed limit on airplanes, right? It's not like you can make a boom that is so loud or whatever. It's not a noise limit. It is a speed limit, right? And so I definitely had the thought that you had before, that it was just like, well, like sonic booms are like way less annoying than motorcycles, leaf blowers, like all this other stuff, right? Especially, cruising at 60,000 feet, right? Like so you would hear it, but it is so much less annoying than all these other things. Like I went to NASA, like I sat in the sonic boom chamber, like they played me the sort of the loud boom and like a muffled boom for the plane they're designing, and I was just struck by like, that's not that annoying. Even the full boom was like not that annoying. And certainly in comparison to the other sounds we have, I don't know how to sort of create like the level playing field across all the different things, because it is, there is a differential benefit between all these different activities that might be producing.
Sure, but we can add that formula. Well. We could add that formulaically to this level playing field. We can make people calculate benefit and probably weighting factor across it. Yeah. That would probably go in favor of aviation.
Yeah, I think it would. Yes, absolutely. Like way more than like a leaf blower, right?
Yeah.
Like I mean, we have
exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah,
you could use an electric leaf blower; it'd be quieter.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, now I'm going to make you look at the other idea as well. So the sandbox idea.
Yeah, I think the sandbox, you could have it two different ways, right? Like one is you could have, something like INL actually like comes open for business, right? Like, and they actually say, hey Brett, if you want to build a nuclear reactor here, like, it's your oyster, right? Go for it. And that would be an amazing an amazing turn for them, but like they could totally do that, right? And I would argue they should do that. And so that's one way to do it. And the other way to do it is to have a class of reactors. I don't know how you draw the cutoff, but either because of like small size or not having very much fuel on board or whatever it is, like say micro reactors. If below a certain threshold, maybe NRC shouldn't have jurisdiction, right? Maybe it should go back to the states, right? And so every state can decide, what the rules are. And I think you could see some like very small reactors getting built, and there being a market for stuff that replaces, a diesel generator or something like that.
I mean, just like your ultralight example, I guarantee you, we would just, like with Last Energy, if there was a rule for that, even if it was beneath the threshold of what we want to develop commercially, we would build a prototype reactor in that reduced regulatory envelope, just to staircase,
just to have experience, right? You give your team a big win, and they can say, I've built a nuclear reactor before.
Yep.
Right.
Okay, well, those are some great ideas. We're going to keep this conversation going over beers, but before we wrap up with our audience, any ideas that you just kind of want to like leave the audience with?
I think that don't be complacent, right? We could be growing a lot faster, and the compounding effect of growing faster, right? So I always think about say 2075, right? So let's say I have 50-ish years or so left. Like, what is the world going to look like then? And it really matters whether we grow at 1% versus 2% versus 4%, right? And those worlds are completely different from each other. And I want to see what happens. If we get to the 4%, right? If we grow 4% a year for the next 50 years, that is a wild world.
Amazing. Eli Dorado, everybody.
And initiate at least a new approach to the many difficult problems that must be solved in both private and public conversation if the world is to shake off the inertia imposed by fear and is to make positive progress toward peace.